It was a busy evening at La Belle Flame, one of the most expensive restaurants in New York City. The lights were soft. The waiters wore white gloves. Expensive wine bottles stood on every table. Laughter and soft music filled the air. Only the richest people came here, celebrities, CEOs, politicians. No one ever walked in without a reservation. Then, the front door creaked open. All heads turned. A man stepped inside. Alone. He didn't fit in. His clothes were old and dusty. He wore a loose black hoodie and faded jeans. His shoes were muddy, and his beard looked like it hadn't been trimmed in weeks. A pair of dark sunglasses hid his eyes. The hostess at the front desk froze. Excuse me, sir, she said politely but nervously. Do you have a reservation? The man didn't answer. He just looked around slowly, as if he had never seen such a place before. At one table, a woman in a silk dress whispered to her husband, "Who let that man in?" Another man wrinkled his nose. "He smells like he came from a garage." Someone laughed. The man ignored them. Quietly, he walked to a small table in the corner of the restaurant. He pulled out the chair and sat down. A waiter rushed over. "Sir, you can't sit here. This table is reserved." Still, the man said nothing. He calmly reached for the menu and opened it. From the kitchen, a loud voice shouted, "What is going on out there?" The door slammed open. Chef Marco stormed out. He was famous in the food world, loud, proud, and never afraid to insult anyone. His white coat had gold buttons. His hat stood tall. He walked like a king in his castle. The hostess ran to him, whispering. In panic, Chef Marco looked at the man in the corner, and his face twisted in disgust. He marched toward the table. "What do you think this is? A soup kitchen?" The man still said nothing. Chef Marco slammed his hand on the table. The plates jumped. I said, "What are you doing here? You think you can just walk in here and sit wherever you want? In these clothes?" The man looked up slightly. His face was calm, almost too calm. Guests had stopped eating. Everyone was watching now. Someone whispered, "This is getting ugly." The manager stepped forward with his phone. "Sir, if you don't leave right now, I will have to call security." The man didn't move. Slowly, he turned a page on the menu. "I'll take the chef's special," he said softly. "The most expensive one." The waiter blinked. "What?" The man repeated, "The most expensive dish." Chef Marco laughed loudly. "You've got jokes, huh? Do you know how much that costs? It's $800. The man reached into his hoodie. People gasped, but instead of a weapon, he pulled out a black credit card. One of those no-limit cards only the super-rich carry. The waiter's eyes widened. That's a Centurion card." Chef Marco grabbed the card, looked at it, and scoffed. "Fake." He threw it back on the table. "Listen here, homeless man," he said in a low voice. "You may think you can fool people, but I've worked too hard for this place to let a street rat eat here. So here's your final warning." He leaned in closer. "Get out before I throw you out." The man didn't blink. Instead, slowly, he reached up to his face and removed his sunglasses. The whole room seemed to freeze. He looked up at Chef Marco with strong, clear eyes. The waiter took a step back. A child from the other side of the room stood up on his chair and stared. "Mom, that man looks like..." Gasps spread across the tables, but no one said it out loud. Yet. Chef Marco's face started to change. A small crack of worry appeared in his proud expression. The man smiled faintly. Just a little curve of the lips. He placed his sunglasses gently on the table. Then he spoke again, louder this time. "I asked for the chef's special. Is that a problem?" The restaurant was silent. It felt as if time had stopped. All eyes were on the man in the corner. The waiter who had been so eager to serve the rich guests now stood frozen, staring at the man who had just removed his sunglasses. His mouth was dry, and his heart raced. Something felt off. Everyone felt. The air seemed thicker, heavier. Chef Marco stood still, his hand still hovering above the table where the black credit card had landed. He was staring at the man with a look of disbelief. For the first time that night, his confidence faltered. He blinked several times and rubbed his eyes. No way. No way could this be happening. Is it really him? The words came from one of the guests near the back of the room. A woman with short blonde hair stood up, her phone in her hand. She looked at the man and then back at her screen, her fingers flying across the screen as she searched for something. A moment later, she gasped. Her voice trembled as she whispered, "Oh my God, it's Vin Diesel." The room went even quieter. Vin Diesel? No one moved. Chef Marco's face turned pale. Vin Diesel? The action movie star? The famous Hollywood actor known for his roles in the Fast and Furious movies? Impossible. The man at the table still hadn't said a word. His calm, relaxed demeanor only made the situation more confusing. How could anyone be so relaxed after being treated so terribly? The waiter stammered, "Sir, can I get you anything else?" Vin Diesel finally spoke, his voice deep and calm. "I told you. I'll have the chef's special." Chef Marco's heart began to race. His mind spun. This couldn't be true. This couldn't be Vin Diesel. Could it? The waiter cautiously stepped back, his eyes glued to the man. He quickly whispered to another waiter who was hovering nearby, trying to figure out what was going on. Vin Diesel. Really? Is that him? The other waiter shrugged. "I don't know, but I think it is." Marco's mind was in chaos. How could he have not recognized the famous actor? This was not just any celebrity. It was Vin Diesel, one of the most recognizable faces in Hollywood. How had he not noticed? The more Marco thought about it, the worse he felt. He had been so quick to judge the man, to make assumptions about him based on his appearance. He had assumed the man was just another beggar or street person trying to sneak into a high-class restaurant. Marco had humiliated him, thrown him out, and made him feel worthless. Now he realized just how wrong he had been. But it wasn't too late, was it? The room buzzed with whispers. The guests were on their phones, trying to get a better look. Some of them were even recording the scene. The more people talked, the more it became clear that the man sitting in the corner was, indeed, Vin Diesel. Marco took a deep breath and forced himself to speak. "Mr. Diesel," he said, his voice suddenly shaking. I didn't recognize you. Please, I'm so sorry for my behavior." Vin Diesel didn't say anything. He just sat there, his hands folded neatly on the table, looking almost too calm for the situation. He raised his hand to stop Marco from apologizing too much. "No need," Vin said simply. "I know what it's like to be judged based on how you look." His words were quiet but powerful. They seemed to echo in the restaurant, where all the guests had suddenly stopped talking, waiting to hear more. Marco felt his stomach twist. Judged based on how you look. It hit Marco hard. The guests watched in silence. Chef Marco shifted nervously, unsure of what to do next. "Would you like to speak to the owner, Mr. Diesel?" Marco asked, his voice small now. Vin Diesel shook his head slowly. "No, I'm fine. I came here for a meal, not an apology." The waiter who had first spoken to him nervously stepped forward, holding a wine glass. Mr. Diesel, can I bring you your wine selection?" Vin nodded. "Yes, that'd be great." The waiter rushed off and the restaurant continued to buzz with the news. Some guests couldn't believe what was happening. Others were excited to meet Vin Diesel, even if they had initially doubted his identity. But Marco was still stuck in a state of shock. How could he have been so wrong? How had he let his pride and judgment cloud his vision? He walked back toward the kitchen, his mind racing. He couldn't stop thinking about what Vin had said. "I know what it's like to be judged based on how you look." Marco had judged this man, this celebrity, based on his appearance. He hadn't taken the time to even consider who he was or where he came from. He had treated him like trash, and now he had to face the consequences. Vin Diesel was still sitting at his table, relaxed and calm as if nothing had happened. And yet Marco knew the truth. He would never forget this night. The lesson had been too painful. The minutes dragged on and the tension in the restaurant only grew stronger. The whispers about Vin Diesel slowly turned into hushed conversations between the guests. all of them trying to confirm what they had seen. No one dared approach him. It was as if everyone was waiting for someone else to make the first move. The man, now known as Vin Diesel, sat completely relaxed at his table, his menu in front of him. He didn't seem bothered at all by the chaos around him, but Chef Marco couldn't sit still. Every few seconds he would look over his shoulder to glance at Vin's table. His thoughts were spinning out of control. Vin Diesel. He had treated him like a nobody, a poor, scruffy man who didn't belong in his high-class restaurant. And now, the entire dining room knew he had just insulted a global superstar. The guests began to quiet down, but there was an electric undercurrent of curiosity. Everyone was pulling out their phones, checking their social media, and searching for any proof that this was, in fact, Vin Diesel. The whispers were growing louder. "Is that really him?" One woman, a young fan in her 20s, pulled up an old photo of Vin Diesel on her phone and stared at it for a moment. Her eyes widened as she compared the photo to the man sitting quietly at the table. She started to walk toward him, but stopped when she saw Chef Marco glaring at her. "I can't be the only one who recognizes him," she muttered to her friend. The friend's face also lit up with realization. "Wait, it's really him. That's the guy from Fast and Furious." The young woman couldn't resist. She walked closer to Vin's table. "I'm sorry to bother you, but are you Vin Diesel?" she asked almost nervously. Vin looked up from his menu and smiled. "You're not bothering me," he said, his voice calm and friendly. "Yes, I am." The fan gasped and quickly pulled out her phone. "Can I get a selfie with you? I'm such a huge fan." Vin nodded with a smile. "Of course, but no flashes." "Okay." As the fan excitedly snapped the photo, Marco watched from the kitchen door, his face growing redder by the second. He couldn't take it anymore. He had to go out there. He had to fix this. But before he could even take a step, the restaurant manager came running down the hallway, his face pale. "Chef Marco. Chef Marco, you need to see this." Marco's heart raced as he followed the manager back to the front of the restaurant. The manager handed him a phone, and Marco's stomach dropped when he saw what was on the screen. It was a video, a live stream of the entire restaurant. The title read, "5-Star Restaurant Insults Vin Diesel, This Will Shock You." Chef Marco's heart pounded. The entire world was going to see this. The video already had thousands of views, and the number was growing. Quickly, Chef Marco looked up. "I need to go out there, now." The manager nodded nervously. "I've already called the owner. He's on his way." Marco felt a tightness in his chest. He didn't need the owner to come. What he needed now was to make things right. But how outside, the truth was spreading like wildfire. Within minutes, the video had exploded on social media. Fans, followers, and even news outlets were picking up the story. The hashtags started to appear. Vin Diesel in disguise, Chef Marco fail, and respect the customer. One of the headlines read, "Chef insults famous actor Vin Diesel. What happens next will shock you." In another corner of the internet, people began to talk about how Chef Marco had treated other guests in the past. Some said he was rude to anyone who wasn't wealthy. Others said he would act like a king, even shouting at his staff. As the world continued to discuss the incident, Chef Marco stood nervously at the edge of the dining room, watching the scene unfold. He had built his career on being the best chef in the city, but today, all of that was being destroyed by his own arrogance and pride. Vin Diesel had already made his point. Back at the table, Vin was calm as ever. He had ordered his meal, and now, he was simply waiting. His phone buzzed, but he didn't pay it any attention. Instead, he looked around the restaurant, watching as people snapped photos and recorded him. He had always been used to the attention, but this felt different. He wasn't just a movie star. Today, he was showing the world something more important. He was showing that people should never be judged by how they look, no matter who they are or where they come from. As the waiters brought his food to the table, Vin took a deep breath and looked at the plate in front of him. It was a beautifully presented dish, but he wasn't here for the food. He was here to send a message. When the waiter stepped back, he turned toward the rest of the room. "I hope you all remember one thing," he said. his voice carrying across the room. "It doesn't matter how you look or where you come from. We all deserve respect." Everyone fell silent. The restaurant owner, Mr. Reed, stormed into the dining room with the weight of the world on his shoulders. His usually calm face was tight with worry, and his footsteps echoed through the silence. The once sophisticated restaurant now felt like a pressure cooker, ready to explode at any moment. "Marco," Mr. Reed said, his voice cold and sharp. "We need to talk, now." Chef Marco, standing in the back, was barely able to speak. His legs felt weak as he slowly walked toward the owner. The entire room seemed to hold its breath, all eyes on the unfolding drama. He had no idea how this situation had spiraled so out of control so quickly. Marco felt like he had lost everything. He'd built this restaurant from the ground up, always priding himself on the fact that he ran a 5-star establishment, known for its high standards and perfect service. But now, everything he had worked for was at risk. And for what? A mistake that could have been avoided if only he hadn't let his arrogance blind him. The guests continued to watch, some with their phones still recording, others whispering to one another, trying to piece together what was happening. I didn't know it was him," Marco stammered, his words tumbling out. "I swear I didn't recognize him." Mr. Reed shot him a look that could freeze fire. "That's not the point, Marco. You treated him like garbage. You humiliated him, and now the world is watching. Do you understand the damage you've caused?" Marco's face reddened as Mr. Reed's words hit him like a slap. He nodded slowly, feeling the weight of the situation. He had made a huge mistake, and there was no way to undo it. I know, Marco whispered, barely able to meet the owner's eyes. "I've messed up." Vin Diesel's calm response. Meanwhile, at the far end of the restaurant, Vin Diesel remained unshaken. He sat at his table, a plate of food now in front of him, untouched. He was aware of the growing tension in the room, the whispers and the camera flashes. But he wasn't bothered. He had made his point, and the lesson he wanted to teach was now out there for the world to see. The waiter returned with a fresh glass of wine. "Mr. Diesel, I'm terribly sorry for the way you were treated. Please, if there's anything we can do to make it up to you." Vin waved him off with a calm smile. "It's okay, don't worry about it." His voice was still gentle, but there was an unmistakable strength behind his words. Vin Diesel had seen his fair share of drama in the spotlight, but today was different. This wasn't just about the attention or the celebrity status. This was about sending a message that no one, no matter their appearance, should ever be treated poorly. Not even by someone like Chef Marco, who had let his pride cloud his judgment. Vin looked around the room, taking in the expressions of the guests who had now realized who he was. Their awe was palpable. Some were still staring at him, while others continued to record the scene, likely in disbelief over what had just transpired. Chef Marco's desperation. Chef Marco, now visibly sweating, turned toward the front of the restaurant, where Mr. Reed was standing with his arms crossed. The owner was talking to the staff, likely organizing a response to the situation. Marco knew what was coming next. The door to the kitchen opened behind Marco, and one of the senior waiters stepped in, his face filled with anxiety. "Chef, the media's outside. They're here already asking questions," the waiter said urgently. Marco's stomach twisted. The media? He hadn't even thought about that. It was one thing for the guests to spread the word on social media, but the media? That would be impossible to control. "I need to go talk to them," Marco muttered under his breath, but Mr. Reed was quick to respond. "No, Marco," Mr. Reed snapped. "You're not talking to anyone. Not until we figure out how to fix this. We're in damage control mode now. If we don't handle this right, we'll lose our reputation. And if this goes viral, we could lose everything." Marco swallowed hard. "But what do we do?" Mr. Reed looked at him sternly. "You apologize. You go out there and you apologize to him." Marco's eyes widened. He hadn't expected that. Apologize to Vin Diesel? The idea felt absurd, but the truth was Mr. Reed was right. The only way to start repairing the damage was to face the man he had insulted and beg for forgiveness. Facing the music, Marco took a deep breath and walked slowly toward the back of the restaurant, where Vin was still sitting, his calmness radiating throughout the room. As Marco approached the table, the weight of his own failure seemed to press down on him. Vin looked up as Marco approached, and for a brief moment, their eyes met. There was no anger in Vin's gaze, just an intense, steady calm. Marco swallowed his pride and took a step closer. "Mr. Diesel, I can't begin to express how sorry I am for what happened earlier. My actions were completely uncalled for," Marco began, his voice trembling slightly. "I let my arrogance and my assumptions cloud my judgment, and I treated you terribly. For that, I apologize." Vin's expression softened and he nodded slowly. "It's okay, Marco. I get it. You're human. We all make mistakes. But what matters is what you learn from them." Marco stood there, humbled. This wasn't what he had expected. He had anticipated anger, maybe even a public confrontation, but instead, he was met with understanding. "I appreciate you taking responsibility," Vin said. "And I hope you'll remember the lesson. Treat everyone with respect, no matter how they look or where they come from. No one should feel less than." Marco nodded, his heart heavy with regret, but also with a newfound understanding. It was clear that the lesson had been learned. The tension in the restaurant had finally begun to settle. After Chef Marco's apology, the air felt less charged, although the guests were still whispering about what had just happened. Some were even applauding Marco's brave decision to apologize. It wasn't easy to admit his mistake, especially not in front of someone as famous as Vin Diesel. But for Marco, it wasn't about saving face anymore. It was about learning and growing. In the past, he would have never thought twice about treating someone like Vin Diesel had been treated. To him, it was all about the image. The image of a five-star restaurant where only the wealthiest could dine. But today, he realized that image meant nothing if it came at the cost of respect. Marco stood at the back of the restaurant, watching as the guests slowly began to return to their meals. His hands were still shaking, but now it wasn't. Out of fear, it was a mix of embarrassment and relief. He knew he had just been given a second chance, and it wasn't one he was going to waste. Vin Diesel's peaceful dinner. Meanwhile, Vin Diesel was still sitting at his table, his meal now half-eaten. He was calm and composed, just as he had been. Throughout the entire ordeal, the guests who had once stared in shock were now beginning to approach him for photos and autographs. But Vin was taking his time. He didn't rush. There was no need. Today wasn't about fame for him. It was about something deeper. The waiter approached again, this time with a glass of water. "Mr. Diesel, we've made a donation to your charity as a gesture of goodwill. We sincerely hope you'll accept it," the waiter said nervously. Vin looked up from his plate, his expression warm. "I appreciate it, thank you. But that's not why I'm here. I'm here because I wanted to remind everyone, including myself, about the importance of kindness. It doesn't matter who someone is or how they look. Everyone deserves respect, the dia." Waiter nodded, clearly touched by his words. Vin took a sip of water before standing up. "Tell Chef Marco I said thank you for the apology, and remind him that we're all human, just trying to get by." As Vin walked out of the restaurant, the buzz in the room only grew louder. His presence had left an indelible mark on everyone. The restaurant that once felt like a place of rigid rules and social status had now turned into something different. It had become a place of reflection. And that wasn't because of the food. It was because of the lesson they had all learned. Chef Marco's redemption back in the kitchen. Marco stood at the counter trying to collect his thoughts. The weight of what had happened still hung heavily on his chest, but he also felt a sense of release. The apology had been hard, but he was glad he had made it. And more importantly, he was glad Vin had accepted it. The staff members who had witnessed the scene exchanged glances, some with approval, others with curiosity. Marco knew he had lost some respect from his team, but he hoped he could earn it back. Actions spoke louder than words, and it was time for Marco to prove that he was not just the head chef at a five-star restaurant, but a man who understood the value of humility. The head waiter walked up to Marco, a hint of a smile on his face. "Chef, that was brave. I've never seen you like that before." Marco sighed. "I wasn't brave. I was stupid. But I learned. And I'm going to make sure this restaurant reflects that. A new beginning for the restaurant." The next few days at the restaurant were different. The atmosphere had changed. Guests who had once been hesitant to come near Marco now greeted him with respect, not because of his reputation, but because they saw a different side of him, a side that was human, just like everyone else. Marco began making small changes to the way the restaurant operated. He focused more on the experience, on making sure each guest, no matter their background, felt like they belonged. The staff began to see him in a new light, too. Marco was no longer the untouchable chef. He was a mentor, someone who genuinely cared about the people who worked for him. Chef Marco's reputation had been shaken, but it was in the process of being rebuilt, brick by brick. He knew it wasn't going to be easy, but he was willing to put in the effort. Vin Diesel's lasting impact. Meanwhile, Vin Diesel's visit had become the talk of the town. News outlets continued to report on the incident, but the narrative had shifted. It wasn't just about the restaurant's mistake. It was about the powerful message Vin had sent about respect and kindness. His fans flooded social media with posts about the importance of treating others with dignity, no matter their appearance. Vin's publicist sent out a statement saying, "Vin Diesel was simply visiting a restaurant, and while the incident was unfortunate, he believes in the power of second chances. He hopes that the lesson learned will inspire others to treat everyone with fairness and respect." The media's changing tune. The media, once ready to rip into Marco and the restaurant, began to shift their focus. They had witnessed the apology, the humility, and the genuine effort Marco was making to change. Stories about Chef Marco's transformation began to emerge, portraying him as a man who had learned from his mistake and was now using his position to create a more inclusive atmosphere. At his restaurant, fans of Vin Diesel praised the actor for not only being a role model in his movies, but also in real life. His actions had set an example for people everywhere, showing them that the most important thing in life wasn't fame, money, or status. It was respect. Chef Marco stood in the quiet of his apartment, phone pressed to his ear. The familiar voice of Vin Diesel on the other end seemed surreal. It was the kind of call that could change everything for Marco. Vin Diesel wanted him at a private event. It wasn't just any event. It was an opportunity to prove that his transformation was real. Marco knew that this could be the moment to turn things around, not just for his career, but for his character. But was he ready? "I'm in," Marco replied, his voice steady despite the rush of emotions flooding his mind. "I'll be there." Vin's voice softened. "Good. You'll meet some great people. Just remember what you've learned. Keep that humility." A night of new beginnings, the night of the event, arrived, and Marco found himself standing outside a grand, private mansion. The mansion was located in one of the wealthiest neighborhoods in the city. A luxurious red carpet stretched out, and sleek cars were parked along the street, their polished surfaces reflecting the lights. It was a world Marco wasn't used to, the world of the elite, the world that once seemed out of reach. His heart raced as he stepped out of the car and walked toward the entrance. The tall, ornate doors opened as he approached, revealing an elegantly dressed crowd inside. There was a soft hum of conversation, the clink of glasses, and the light laughter of people enjoying their evening. Marco spotted Vin standing near a group of people, laughing and chatting with a few guests. His tall frame stood out, and his presence commanded attention, but there was a calmness to him, something that made everyone around him feel comfortable and at ease. Vin caught Marco's eye and nodded toward him, a friendly smile on his face. Marco couldn't help but feel grateful that Vin had invited him. He walked over, trying to ignore the butterflies in his stomach. "Marco, glad you made it." Vin greeted him with a firm handshake, his smile warm. "Thank you for the invitation. This means a lot," Marco said, his voice filled with sincerity. Vin motioned for him to follow. "Come on, let me introduce you to some people. Tonight's about learning, connecting, and making the right impression. A conversation with legends. As the evening wore on, Marco found himself engaged in meaningful conversations with people from all walks of life. There were chefs, business owners, even a few celebrities. Every conversation carried a sense of respect, and Marco noticed that people weren't just interested in his position or reputation. They were genuinely curious about who he was as a person. It was a stark contrast to the shallow world of fine dining he had once known. As Marco spoke to a renowned food critic, he noticed that his anxiety had begun to fade. He no longer felt the need to prove himself. For the first time, Marco realized that success wasn't about appearances. It was about connection, humility, and making a positive impact on others. Vin remained by Marco's side, occasionally checking in and offering words of encouragement. Marco couldn't help but admire the actor's ability to connect with everyone, regardless of their background. Vin's actions spoke volumes, and Marco had begun to see him not just as a celebrity, but as someone who truly cared about making the world a better place. The speech. As the night progressed, Vin took the stage to give a short speech. The crowd gathered around, eager to hear what he had to say. Marco stood near the back, listening intently. "Thank you all for being here tonight," Vin began, his voice calm but powerful. "We're here to celebrate not just success, but the power of second chances, the power of learning from our mistakes and growing from them. I've had my fair share of failures, and I know how humbling it can be." The crowd nodded in agreement, hanging on every word. "I invited some of you here tonight because I believe in the importance of surrounding yourself with people who are willing to learn, to improve, and to make a difference," Vin continued. "Marco, the chef over there, is a perfect example of that. He made a mistake, but he didn't let it define him. He took responsibility, apologized, and changed. That's what real strength is." Marco's heart swelled with pride as the room turned to look at him. He hadn't expected this. This wasn't about fame or recognition. It was about something